Close your eyes for just a moment if you'd like, and imagine this, the gentle flicker of candlelight dancing across stone walls, the faint crackle of a hearth in the distance, and the soothing whisper of a breeze weaving through ancient cypress. Trees. The world outside may be hurried, noisy, and unsettled, but here in this moment we step into another time. A time when Florence was the beating heart of culture, power, and ambition. Tonight, together, we'll peel back the velvet curtain of history and wander through gilded halls, shadowy alleys, and secret chambers to uncover the dark secrets of the Medici family. The Medici, a name that has survived the centuries, whispered, with reverence and suspicion alike. To some, they were enlightened patrons, protectors of art, science, and human progress. To others, they were ruthless manipulators, masters of intrigue, and symbols of corruption disguised as respectability. Their story is not just about Florence or even Italy. It is about the way power shapes human lives, the way money can rewrite destiny, and the way ambition leaves behind both masterpieces and scars. But before we dive into conspiracies, poisonings, betrayals, and grand dynastic schemes, we must understand where it all began. For even the grandest empires sprout from humble roots, the roots of the Medici in the late Middle Ages. Italy was not a unified nation, but a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states. Venice with its ships, Milan with its armies, Rome with its popes, and Florence with its merchants and bankers. Florence, in particular, stood as a jewel of trade and finance, a republic where wealth and influence mattered as much, if not more, than noble blood. And it was here, in Florence, that the Medici family rose from relative obscurity. Their earliest origins can be traced back to the Mugello, a rural valley north of the city, where the family began as modest landowners. The name Medici itself suggests healing, literally doctors, and though legends claim they descended from a heroic physician of Charlemagne's army, the truth was far simpler. They were not princes or warriors, but shrewd men who understood the quiet power of money. By the 13th century, Florence was exploding with opportunity. Its wool trade dominated Europe, its guilds shaped civic life, and its bankers began financing kings and popes. Among these bankers were the Medici. They were not the first Florentine family to lend money, nor the richest at the time, but they were different. They were cautious, calculating, and most importantly, masters at cultivating trust. Giovanni de' Medici, the architect of fortune. The true foundation of Medici power began with Giovanni de' Medici, born in 1360. Giovanni was not destined for greatness at first glance. He was modest in demeanor, a man who preferred simplicity over ostentation. Yet behind his calm exterior was a mind as sharp as a dagger. Giovanni understood that banking was not merely about lending money. It was about weaving influence. He expanded the Medici Bank into one of the most trusted financial institutions in Europe. Unlike other bankers who flaunted their wealth, Giovanni often presented himself as approachable and humble. This made rulers and popes more willing to deal with him. Perhaps his most brilliant move was aligning the Medici fortune with the Catholic Church. In 1410, Giovanni cleverly backed the candidacy of Baldassare Cossa, who became Pope John XXIII. Though this pope's reign was controversial, it brought Giovanni immense influence. Suddenly, the Medici Bank was not just another Florentine business, it was the financial arm of the papacy itself. To be banker to the Pope was to hold the purse strings of Christendom. Giovanni invested carefully, avoiding reckless speculation. He lived by a simple maxim: remain rich by appearing poor. This philosophy would echo through the family for generations. While other nobles squandered fortunes on tournaments and lavish feasts, Giovanni quietly built an empire of credit, trust, and subtle alliances. By the time of his death in 1429, Giovanni had laid the foundations of a dynasty. His will was equally revealing of his philosophy. He urged his heirs to avoid pride, to remain close to the people, and to remember that fortune could vanish as easily as it appeared. It was advice that some of his descendants would heed, and others would tragically ignore. Cosimo de' Medici, the first of the greats after Giovanni's passing, leadership fell to his son, Cosimo de' Medici. Known later as Cosimo the Elder, he would become the first true patriarch of the dynasty, a man who transformed the family from wealthy bankers into the unofficial rulers of Florence. Cosimo inherited not just money, but his father's keen sense of politics. Florence, at this time, was a republic in name, but in practice it was ruled by shifting factions of elite families, each struggling for dominance. The Albizzi family, powerful rivals of the Medici, dominated Florentine politics in the early 15th century. They viewed the Medici with suspicion, seeing in them a rising force that might eclipse their own influence. And indeed, they were right to be wary. Cosimo used the Medici Bank to spread influence across Florence and beyond. He lent money to allies, sponsored artists, and quietly built a network of loyalty that stretched from the common artisan to the papal throne. But success breeds enemies. In 1433, the Albizzi struck. They accused Cosimo of trying to overthrow the Republic and had him arrested. His fate hung by a thread. Some called for his execution, but Cosimo, calm and deliberate as always, managed to turn the tables. He bribed the prison guards, charmed his captors, and eventually secured his release, albeit on the condition that he go into exile. Exile, however, did not break him. While staying in Venice, Cosimo observed and waited. Back in Florence, the Albizzi mismanaged affairs, alienating allies and weakening their grip. Within a year, the city called Cosimo back. He returned in triumph, and the Albizzi were banished. Instead, from this point forward, the Medici were the unchallenged power behind the Florentine Republic. Patronage, as power Cosimo's genius, was not simply in finance or politics, but in understanding the currency of culture. He knew that wealth, when transformed into art and architecture, became something greater, immortality. He commissioned the magnificent Medici Palace, designed by Michelozzo, a building that still stands as a testament to Renaissance elegance. But more importantly, he invested in Florence itself. He funded churches, monasteries, and libraries, ensuring that the Medici name was inscribed into the very stones of the city. Perhaps his greatest act of patronage was supporting the intellectual revival that became the Renaissance. Cosimo gathered scholars, philosophers, and artists, encouraging the study of classical texts long forgotten in medieval Europe. He funded translations of Plato, supported the work of thinkers like Marsilio Ficino, and opened his vast personal library to the public. It is said that without Cosimo, the Renaissance might never have flourished as it did. Yet behind this patronage was always strategy. By presenting himself as the benefactor of Florence, Cosimo cloaked his political dominance in generosity. The people saw him not as a tyrant, but as a father of the city. Still, not all was light. Rumors swirled of corruption, secret deals, and intimidation. The Medici, after all, did not rule by official decree. They ruled through influence, through invisible threads of obligation and fear. Those who opposed them often found themselves ruined, exiled, or worse. Shadows of power Cosimo's reign marked the beginning of what many historians call the Medici regime. Though officially Florence remained a republic, it was a delicate balance. The Medici never crowned themselves kings, yet their will guided the city as surely as any monarch's. This duality, the image of humble citizens on the surface, but masters of destiny beneath, would define the Medici for centuries. They were both admired and resented, protectors of art and accused corrupters of liberty. Their name evoked gratitude and suspicion in equal measure. When Cosimo died in 1464, he was buried in the church of San Lorenzo beneath a simple tomb that read Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. For many Florentines, the title was well earned. For others, it was the mark of a man who had bent the Republic to his will. And so begins the Medici saga, a family that rose from the quiet valleys of Mugello to shape the destiny of Florence, Italy, and Europe itself. Their story would give birth to masterpieces and scandals, alliances and betrayals, piety and poison. But if Cosimo was the father of Florence, his heirs would inherit both his brilliance and his burdens. Some would guide the city into new heights of glory, others would plunge it into darkness. And as we step further into their tale, we will begin to see how power, once gained, demands ever more dangerous choices to keep. The age of Lorenzo the Magnificent. The candlelight of our journey now falls upon a new figure, one who would come to define not only the Medici family, but the entire spirit of Florence in its golden age. His name was Lorenzo de' Medici, though history remembers him as Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent. His reign would bring Florence to dazzling heights of culture, poetry, and art, while at the same time plunging the family into deadly conspiracies, rivalries, and betrayals that exposed the darker edge of their power. Piero the Gouty, a fragile interlude. When Cosimo the Elder died in 1464, the immense responsibility of leading both the family and the city passed to his son, Piero de' Medici. Piero was intelligent but physically frail, stricken with painful gout that confined him to his bed for much of his life. For this reason, he was mockingly nicknamed Piero il Gottoso, Piero the Gouty. Despite his condition, Piero held the family's power together with surprising resilience. He continued to manage the Medici Bank and navigated the treacherous waters of Florentine politics. But his health was always in question, and enemies of the Medici, most notably the rival Pazzi and Albizzi families, watched for an opportunity to strike. During Piero's short leadership, the Medici fortune also began to face strains. Banking was a risky enterprise in the 15th century. Monarchs often defaulted on loans, and wars could destabilize entire regions. Still, Piero's careful management preserved the Medici's position until his death in 1469. And it was then, in the wake of his passing, that the torch of power was handed to his 20-year-old son, Lorenzo. The rise of Lorenzo, the Magnificent. Lorenzo de' Medici was not only wealthy and well-connected, he was a man of immense charisma. Tall, broad-shouldered, and confident, Lorenzo possessed both a commanding presence and a gift for words. He was a poet, a philosopher, and above all, a master of diplomacy. At just 20, he stepped into the role of Florence's leading statesman. Officially, he held no royal title. Florence remained, at least in theory, a republic. But in practice, Lorenzo controlled the levers of power with unmatched skill. He understood that Florence's fragile stability depended on balancing rival factions within the city, as well as navigating the volatile politics of the Italian peninsula, where powerful neighbors like Milan, Naples, and the Papal States loomed. Lorenzo's leadership quickly earned him respect. He projected generosity, often walking among the people, hosting festivals, and ensuring that the citizens of Florence associated the Medici name with prosperity and joy. At the same time, he consolidated his family's dominance, rewarding loyal supporters and quietly silencing his enemies. But what truly set Lorenzo apart was his patronage of the arts, the golden age of Florence. To understand why Lorenzo was called the Magnificent, one must walk the streets of Florence in the late 15th century. Imagine the hum of artisans' workshops, the scent of fresh plaster where murals were being painted, the clang of chisels on marble. This was a city alive with creativity, and Lorenzo stood at its center. He supported a young artist named Sandro Botticelli, whose ethereal paintings, like the birth of Venus and Primavera, would become icons of the Renaissance. He nurtured the careers of great thinkers, philosophers, and poets, including Marsilio Ficino and Angelo Poliziano, whose writings reshaped European thought. Perhaps most famously, Lorenzo gave early encouragement to a talented teenage sculptor named Michelangelo Buonarroti. The boy was even welcomed into the Medici household, where he absorbed the intellectual atmosphere of Lorenzo's court. Without Lorenzo's patronage, the world might never have known the genius who would one day paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling and carve the David. Through this cultural flowering, Lorenzo turned Florence into the artistic capital of Europe. His support for art and philosophy was not merely generosity, it was strategy. By associating the Medici name with beauty, knowledge, and human achievement, Lorenzo elevated his family beyond mere bankers. They became symbols of civilization itself. The gathering storm, rivalries, deepened but as Florence glowed under the light of Renaissance brilliance, shadows gathered in its alleys. Rival families seethed at the Medici's dominance. Chief among these rivals were the Pazzi, another wealthy Florentine clan who resented Lorenzo's hold over the Republic. The Pazzi were not alone in their discontent. The papacy itself, under Pope Sixtus IV, also grew hostile toward the Medici. Initially allies, the Medici and the Pope clashed over control of wealth and influence. When the Medici Bank refused to finance one of Sixtus's ambitious projects, the Pope turned instead to the Pazzi. This alliance between papal power and Florentine rivals set the stage for one of the most shocking conspiracies of the Renaissance. The Pazzi Conspiracy. The Pazzi Conspiracion. A spring morning, April 26, 1478, Florence gathered in its great cathedral, the Duomo of Santa Maria del Fiore. It was Easter Sunday, a day of celebration and devotion. But hidden among the worshippers were assassins. The plan was bold, to strike at the very heart of the Medici family by killing both Lorenzo and his younger brother, Giuliano, during the sacred Mass. If successful, the Medici grip on Florence would collapse in an instant. As the service began, the conspirators moved. Giuliano was set upon first. He was stabbed 19 times, collapsing in a pool of blood beneath the cathedral's soaring dome. Lorenzo, too, was attacked, but fate, or perhaps fortune, was with him. Wounded, he managed to draw his cloak around himself and escape into the sacristy, where he barricaded the doors until the danger passed. The conspiracy failed. Giuliano lay dead, but Lorenzo survived. And his survival would unleash a storm of vengeance. The people of Florence, loyal to the Medici, rose against the conspirators. Many of the Pazzi were captured, dragged through the streets, and executed. Francesco de' Pazzi, one of the ringleaders, was hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria, his lifeless body swaying as a grim warning. Pope Sixtus IV, however, was outraged by the violence against his allies. He excommunicated Lorenzo and placed Florence under interdict, banning the city from receiving the sacraments. What followed was open war, as the Papal States and the Kingdom of Naples marched against Florence. Lorenzo the diplomat. At this critical moment, Lorenzo revealed his greatest strength: diplomacy. Knowing Florence could not withstand a prolonged war against such powerful enemies, Lorenzo took an extraordinary gamble. In 1479, he personally traveled to Naples, placing himself at the mercy of King Ferrante, one of the Medici's fiercest foes. It was an audacious move. He could have been imprisoned, executed, or used as a bargaining chip. But Lorenzo's charm and eloquence prevailed. He persuaded Ferrante that peace was more beneficial than war. His mission succeeded. The alliance against Florence crumbled, and the Republic was spared destruction. Upon his return, Lorenzo was hailed as a hero, his position in Florence stronger than ever. The failed conspiracy had nearly destroyed him, but instead it transformed him into an almost untouchable figure, revered and feared alike. Power and paradox. Lorenzo's later years were marked by both triumph and challenge. He continued to sponsor art and philosophy, ensuring that Florence remained the beating heart of the Renaissance. His court became a gathering place for some of the greatest minds of the age, blending politics with poetry, religion with humanism. Yet beneath the brilliance lay cracks. The Medici Bank, once the foundation of the family's wealth, was weakening. Branches in London and Bruges suffered heavy losses, partly due to mismanagement and partly due to Lorenzo's lavish spending on art and politics. By the time of his death, the bank that Giovanni and Cosimo had so carefully built was a shadow of its former self. Still, Lorenzo managed to preserve the family's dominance. His reputation as Il Magnifico was not merely a title, it was a recognition of his extraordinary ability to embody both the splendor and the ruthlessness of Renaissance Florence. The death of Lorenzo in 1492, Lorenzo fell gravely ill. He was only 43 years old. As he lay dying in his villa at Careggi, the city he had shaped so profoundly was thrown into mourning. It is said that Michelangelo, still a young man, visited him in his final days. The great philosopher Marsilio Ficino described Lorenzo's passing as the end of an age. Even Pope Innocent VIII, once an adversary, is reported to have remarked, "The loss of such a man is a loss not only to Florence, but to all of Italy." When Lorenzo died, Florence lost not just a leader, but a stabilizing force. The careful balance he had maintained between rival powers began to crumble. Ahead lay turbulence, the rise of fiery voices of reform, and the decline of Medici fortunes. The candle we've been following flickers lower now, casting both light and shadow across the memory of Lorenzo the Magnificent. His era was a time of beauty and blood, of soaring achievements and sudden violence. He left behind a Florence radiant with art, yet vulnerable to chaos. And as we continue, we will see what happened when Lorenzo's heirs, less skilled, less commanding, took his place. The Medici flame would sputter, threatened by foreign invasions, religious zeal, and their own missteps. The question became not whether the Medici could rule Florence, but whether they could even survive. Decline and exile. The death of Lorenzo the Magnificent in 1492 marked more than the passing of a single man. It was the end of a delicate balance that had held Florence together. For nearly 2 decades, Lorenzo's charisma and skill had managed to keep the city's enemies at bay and its people largely united. Without him, Florence was left like a ship suddenly deprived of its captain, adrift upon turbulent seas. Piero the Unfortunate, into this void stepped Lorenzo's eldest son, Piero de' Medici. History would come to know him by a cruel epithet, Piero il Sfortunato, Piero the Unfortunate. He was only 21, lacking the wisdom, composure, and diplomatic brilliance of his father. Where Lorenzo was cautious, Piero was impulsive. Where Lorenzo charmed allies, Piero alienated them. Almost immediately, Florence found itself in crisis. Italy, in the late 15th century, was a chessboard of competing powers: France, Spain, the Papal States, Naples, Venice, and Milan. Each city-state and kingdom shifted alliances constantly, seeking advantage in an endless game of intrigue and war. Lorenzo had navigated this treacherous landscape with masterful diplomacy. Piero, however, was unprepared. In 1494, King Charles VIII of France launched an invasion of Italy, claiming rights to the Kingdom of Naples. His armies, equipped with modern artillery that terrified opponents, swept into the peninsula. When Charles approached Florence, Piero panicked. Instead of rallying the city's defenses or negotiating skillfully, he agreed to humiliating terms. He surrendered Florentine fortresses, ceded territories, and effectively handed control of the Republic to the French king. To the proud citizens of Florence, it was nothing less than betrayal. The city erupted. Crowds gathered in anger, denouncing Piero. He fled Florence in disgrace, abandoning both his family and his city. For the first time in 60 years, the Medici were cast out of power. The rise of Savonarola. With the Medici gone, Florence turned to a new kind of leader. Not a banker, not a soldier, but a preacher. His name was Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar whose fiery sermons had long warned of divine punishment for Florence's sins. Savonarola was a striking figure, tall, gaunt, with a piercing gaze and a voice that could electrify his listeners. For years, he had railed against the corruption of the church, the vanity of the elites, and the immorality of the city. When Charles VIII's armies swept through Italy, Savonarola declared it was God's scourge upon a decadent people. To many Florentines, his words rang true. With the Medici expelled, Savonarola rose as the moral guide of the Republic. He envisioned Florence as a new Jerusalem, a city purified of vice and dedicated to God. His sermons drew thousands into the streets calling for repentance and reform. A puritanical Florence, under Savonarola's influence, Florence changed dramatically. Gambling, prostitution, and secular entertainments were suppressed. Citizens were urged to abandon luxuries, to live modestly and piously. Children patrolled the streets, reporting on neighbors who clung to worldly pleasures. The most dramatic symbol of this new order came in 1497 with the infamous Bonfire of the Vanities. On that day, citizens piled up objects deemed sinful: mirrors, cosmetics, fine clothes, playing cards, even works of art and books. Flames devoured them in a public square, rising into the sky as a sign of Florence's supposed purification. Yet, while Savonarola commanded great influence, he also made dangerous enemies. His denunciations of corruption extended even to Pope Alexander VI, the infamous Rodrigo Borgia. The Pope, enraged, demanded that Savonarola be silenced. When the friar refused to submit, he was excommunicated. By 1498, the tide had turned against him. Once revered, Savonarola was now seen as a fanatic who had brought Florence into conflict with Rome and stifled its prosperity. The same people who had once cheered him dragged him to trial. Under torture, he confessed to false charges, and on May 23, 1498, Savonarola was executed in the Piazza della Signoria, his body burned to ashes where the bonfire of the vanities had once roared. Florence, once again, was left searching for stability, the Medici in exile. Meanwhile, the Medici family, scattered and humiliated, lived in exile. Piero wandered Italy, seeking allies to restore his power, but he found little success. His failure earned him lasting disgrace, and he died in obscurity in 1503 after drowning in a river while on campaign. But though Piero failed, the Medici spirit endured in the next generation. His younger brother, Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, and his cousin Giulio carefully preserved the family's influence in Rome. They remained patient, biding their time. The Medici had lost Florence before, during Cosimo's exile, and had returned stronger. They believed the same would happen again. Their hopes rested particularly on Giovanni, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who had been groomed for leadership. Giovanni was only 17 when the Medici were expelled, but his training, intellect and connections in the church positioned him well for a future comeback. Florence in turmoil. The years after Savonarola's fall were marked by political instability. Florence remained officially a republic, but factions and rivalries tore at its fabric. At times, France exerted influence. At others, Spain or the papacy. The city longed for stability, yet resisted the idea of submitting once more to Medici rule. It was during this period of uncertainty that a new voice entered Florence's political stage, a young diplomat and thinker named Niccolò Machiavelli. Serving the Republic, Machiavelli traveled across Europe, studying the ways of kings and generals. His sharp observations would one day crystallize in his famous work, The Prince, much of which was inspired by the very rise and fall of the Medici. Machiavelli's career thrived under the Republic, but he would soon find himself at odds with the very family whose return he later chronicled. Foreign invasions. Italy in the late 15th and early 16th centuries was a battlefield for greater powers. The French, Spanish and Holy Roman Empire each sought dominance, using Florence and other city-states as pawns in their larger struggles. In 1512, the balance of power shifted dramatically. The armies of Spain, allied with the papacy, marched into Florence. The fragile republic, exhausted by years of internal division and external threats, crumbled under pressure. And with the Spanish victory, the Medici returned. The return of the Medici. Giovanni de' Medici, now a cardinal in the Catholic Church, and his cousin Giulio seized the opportunity to reclaim their family's dominance. Backed by Spanish troops, they re-entered Florence in triumph, restoring Medici rule after nearly 20 years of exile. The Republic was abolished, and the Medici once again stood at the head of Florence. But this time, their return was different. They no longer needed to pretend to be mere citizens, exercising influence behind the scenes. Instead, they began transforming their position into open, hereditary rule. Giovanni, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, had endured hardship and exile. But greater heights awaited him. Only a year after his return to Florence, in 1513, he achieved something no Medici had ever accomplished before. He was elected Pope. As Leo Vix, Giovanni de' Medici would bring his family to the pinnacle of spiritual power, ushering in a new chapter of glory and controversy. The candle of our story now burns brighter, but more dangerously. We have seen how Lorenzo's death led to decline, how Piero's failures brought exile, and how Florence fell under the fiery spell of Savonarola. But we have also seen how, like phoenixes from the ashes, the Medici clawed their way back. Ahead lies their most astonishing transformation, from bankers and patrons to popes and princes. With Giovanni's rise to the papacy, the Medici would wield not only the purse strings of Europe, but also the keys of heaven itself. And yet, with this ascent came scandals, indulgences, and a new kind of crisis that would shake Christianity to its core. Pope Leo VI and the seeds of Reformation, the Medici, once exiled and disgraced, now stood not just at the head of Florence, but at the very summit of Christendom. In 1513, Giovanni de' Medici, son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, became Pope Leo II. For the Medici, it was a triumph beyond imagining. For the world, it would prove to be a turning point, one that blended breathtaking magnificence with profound controversy. Giovanni de' Medici, from Florence to Rome. Giovanni was born in 1475, the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. From childhood, he was marked for a career in the church. At the astonishingly young age of 13, he was made a cardinal, a reflection of the Medici's influence rather than any spiritual calling. Yet Giovanni took his clerical role seriously, receiving a solid humanist education steeped in classical learning. During the Medici exile, Giovanni had been forced to wander Europe, but he never abandoned his ambitions. His years in Florence and Rome taught him the importance of patience and strategy. By the time the Medici returned to power in 1512, Giovanni was a seasoned figure in church politics, well prepared to ascend higher. The following year, the College of Cardinals elected him Pope. At just 38, Giovanni became Leo VI, the first Medici ever to sit upon the throne of St. Peter, a Medici Pope. For Florence, Leo VI's election was nothing less than miraculous. The Medici family, once humble bankers from Mugello, had risen to a level that no rival family could match. They were no longer merely the hidden rulers of a republic. They now held sway over the universal church. Leo brought with him the Renaissance spirit of his upbringing. He loved music, poetry, theatre, and art. He filled the Vatican with celebrations, pageants, and grand feasts. His court was a dazzling display of colour and sound, where artists and musicians found generous patronage. One observer remarked, "Leo lived as a true prince, not as a friar. To many, he embodied the glory of Renaissance culture, but to others, his reign symbolized excess, worldliness, and corruption at the heart of the church. Wealth, splendor, and debt. Leo VI's papacy was marked by extravagance. He loved magnificent banquets, hunts, and elaborate spectacles. At one festival, he staged a mock naval battle in the flooded courtyard of the Vatican. At another, he watched a procession of exotic animals, including a white elephant gifted by the King of Portugal. But such spectacles cost dearly. The Vatican treasury, already strained by his predecessor, sank deeper into debt under Leo's lavish spending. To finance his projects, he relied heavily on the traditional tools of papal finance, the sale of offices, indulgences, and loans. Indulgences, in particular, became a scandal. For centuries, the Church had granted indulgences as spiritual remissions of sin, often in exchange for pious acts or pilgrimages. Under Leo, indulgences became a fundraising tool on a massive scale. The proceeds were used to finance grand works, including the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, a project Leo considered essential to cement his legacy. The campaign for indulgences, however, would ignite a fire that could not be contained. The spark of Martin Luther in Germany. A monk named Martin Luther watched the indulgence campaign with mounting outrage. To him, the practice had become a grotesque perversion of faith, a way of turning salvation into a financial transaction. In 1517, Luther penned his 95 Theses, denouncing indulgences and challenging the authority of the Pope himself. The theses spread rapidly, fueled by the new technology of the printing press. What might once have remained a local dispute became a Europe-wide revolution. Luther's challenge struck at the very foundation of papal authority. Leo VI dismissed him at first as a drunken German who would soon change his mind. But Luther did not recant. Instead, his movement grew, drawing support from princes and reformers across the continent. By 1520, Leo formally excommunicated him, yet the tide could not be reversed. The Protestant Reformation had begun. Inadvertently, Leo X had presided over one of the most seismic ruptures in Christian history. The papacy that had seemed unassailable now faced a movement that questioned its legitimacy altogether. Leo and Florence, while the Reformation storm gathered, Leo never forgot his Medici roots. He worked to secure Florence firmly under Medici control, appointing family members to key positions and reinforcing their dominance. Under his papacy, Florence increasingly resembled a hereditary principality rather than a republic. He also poured resources into art and architecture. In Rome, he continued the transformation of the Vatican into a Renaissance masterpiece, supporting artists such as Raphael, who painted the famous Stanze di Raffaello, the Raphael Rooms. His reign turned the Vatican into a gallery of beauty, though funded at enormous cost. Florence, too, benefited from Leo's attention. The Medici used papal wealth and influence to shape the city's political life, ensuring that the family's grip would not again be so easily shaken. The death of Leo VI Leo's papacy lasted only 8 years, but it left an indelible mark. In December 1521, he died suddenly at the age of 46, likely from pneumonia, though rumors of poisoning swirled, as they so often did in Renaissance Italy. His death was met with mixed reactions. Admirers mourned a pope who had celebrated the arts and elevated Rome to new splendor. Critics accused him of draining the church's coffers, indulging in worldliness, and failing to recognize the seriousness of Luther's challenge until it was too late. As one contemporary remarked, Leo enjoyed the papacy as if it were a gift of fortune, not a responsibility of God. For the Medici, however, his papacy was a triumph. A Medici had worn the papal tiara. The family had reached heights their ancestors could scarcely have imagined, and they were not finished. Another Medici, Giulio, cousin to Leo and son of Lorenzo's, brother Giuliano, would soon follow him to the throne of St. Peter, Giulio de' Medici. The path to power Giulio de' Medici had been born in 1478 under tragic circumstances. His father, Giuliano, was assassinated during the infamous Pazzi conspiracy, leaving Giulio illegitimate and vulnerable. Yet Lorenzo the Magnificent raised him as part of the family, ensuring he received a fine education. Like Giovanni, Giulio entered the church and became a cardinal. He was shrewd, politically astute, and determined to uphold the Medici legacy. After Leo X's death, Giulio maneuvered skillfully within the College of Cardinals. In 1523, he succeeded, ascending to the papacy as Clement VII. If Leo X had embodied Renaissance splendor, Clement VII would face Renaissance tragedy. His papacy would be tested by wars, betrayals, and one of the darkest chapters in Rome's history, the sack of 1527. Florence. Without Leo back in Florence, the death of Leo VI also created uncertainty. The Medici still ruled, but the Republic's traditions had not entirely vanished. Many citizens resented the family's growing dominance and longed for a return to freedom. The tension simmered beneath the surface, ready to ignite in times of crisis. The Medici had climbed higher than ever before, but their position was precarious. They had papal power, artistic glory, and immense prestige. Yet they were also entangled in the storms of European politics and religious upheaval. The candlelight that had once glowed with Renaissance brilliance now trembled against the winds of war and reform. The Medici would face challenges unlike any they had seen before, challenges that would shake not only Florence and Rome, but the entire Catholic world. The next stage of our story brings us into the era of Clement VII, where the Medici papacy collided with the titanic forces of empire and reform. Rome itself would burn, Florence would revolt, and the Medici would once again fight to cling to survival. Clement VII and the sack of Rome. The Medici had climbed to dazzling heights with Leo X, yet glory in Renaissance Italy often carried the seeds of disaster. In 1523, Giulio de' Medici, cousin of Leo and son of the slain Giuliano, ascended the papal throne as Clement VII. His reign would prove far more turbulent than his predecessors, marked not by festivals and patronage, but by wars, betrayals, and a catastrophe that shook the world, the sack of Rome. Giulio de' Medici. A life shaped by violence. Giulio's life began in tragedy. Born in 1478, he was the illegitimate son of Giuliano de' Medici, who was murdered in the Duomo during the Pazzi conspiracy. His mother, Fioretta Gorini, died soon after, leaving the infant Giulio an orphan. But Lorenzo the Magnificent, Giulio's uncle, took the boy under his wing. ensuring he was educated and raised within the Medici circle. Despite his illegitimacy, Giulio's talent and loyalty earned him a place in the church. By 1513, when his cousin Giovanni became Pope Leo X, Giulio was already a cardinal. He became one of Leo's closest advisors, known for his caution and political savvy. When Leo died in 1521, Giulio initially failed to secure the papacy, but within 2 years his maneuvering succeeded. In 1523, he was elected Pope Clement VII, becoming the second Medici pope. A dangerous world Clement's reign began in a Europe torn apart by rivalries. The two most powerful monarchs of the age, King Francis I of France and Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, were locked in a bitter struggle for dominance in Italy. The papacy, as both a spiritual authority and a temporal power, was caught in the middle. Clement tried to play the cautious diplomat, shifting alliances between France and Spain to preserve papal independence. But this balancing act proved disastrous. By alienating both sides at different moments, Clement left himself dangerously exposed. Trouble in Florence. Meanwhile, Florence remained under Medici rule, governed by Clement's relatives. The city had not forgotten its republican traditions, nor its resentment of Medici dominance. Clement's papacy was seen by many Florentines as further proof that their city was being treated as a family possession rather than a free republic. Unrest simmered, waiting for the right moment to erupt. The sack of Rome, 1527, that moment, came with one of the most shocking events in Renaissance history. In 1527, Clement aligned himself with King Francis I of France against Emperor Charles V. The move backfired spectacularly. Charles's troops, many of them unpaid mercenaries, mutinied and marched on Rome. On May 6, 1527, they stormed the city. What followed was not a mere military occupation, but a horror that stunned Europe. The imperial troops, German landsknechts, Spanish soldiers and Italian mercenaries looted churches, palaces and homes with unrestrained brutality. The streets of Rome ran red with blood. Priests and nuns were slaughtered. Sacred relics were desecrated and priceless works of art were destroyed. The Vatican itself was overrun. The Swiss Guard made a heroic last stand on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, buying enough time for Clement to escape into Castel Sant'Angelo, the papal fortress connected to the Vatican by a hidden passage. Out of 189 guards, only 42 survived. For months, Rome endured a reign of terror. The Eternal City, once the proud capital of Christendom, was reduced to ashes and misery. Clement in captivity, Clement himself became a prisoner. Trapped in Castel Sant'Angelo, he was forced to endure humiliation and deprivation. The Pope, who had tried to balance Europe's great powers, now found himself utterly at their mercy. Eventually, he negotiated his release by paying a massive ransom and conceding vast concessions to Emperor Charles V. But his authority was shattered. The sack of Rome was not just a military defeat. It was a spiritual catastrophe that exposed the vulnerability of the papacy and weakened its prestige at a moment when the Protestant Reformation was already tearing Christendom apart. Florence in revolt. The shockwaves of Rome's sack spread quickly. In Florence, the disaster emboldened the Republicans. If the Pope himself could be humiliated, why should Florence submit to his family's rule? In 1527, the city rose in revolt, expelling the Medici once again. The Florentine Republic was re-established, this time under the influence of fiery Republican leaders inspired by both humanist ideals and the memory of Savonarola. For a brief period, it seemed the Medici might be permanently cast out of their native city. Clement's struggle. Yet Clement was not finished. Though weakened, he still held the papal throne, and with it, immense influence. Over the following years, he worked tirelessly to restore Medici power in Florence. His tool would be none other than Emperor Charles V, the very man whose troops had devastated Rome. In a twist of political irony, Clement forged an alliance with the emperor, sealing it with a dynastic marriage. His niece, Catherine de' Medici, was betrothed to Charles's relative, the future King Henry II of France. This marriage would later carry Medici blood into the heart of French royalty, shaping the course of European history for generations. In exchange, Charles agreed to restore Medici control in Florence. The Siege of Florence in 1529, imperial troops descended upon Florence, laying siege to the reborn republic. The city resisted fiercely, inspired by ideals of liberty and the writings of men like Niccolò Machiavelli, who had long dreamed of a strong, independent Florence. The siege lasted nearly a year, from October 1529 to August 1530. It was a brutal test of endurance. Hunger, disease, and bombardment ravaged the population, yet Florentines held out with remarkable courage, determined to preserve their republic. Ultimately, however, the might of the empire prevailed. In August 1530, Florence surrendered. The republic was crushed and the Medici returned in triumph, this time not as covert rulers, but as outright princes, their power backed by imperial arms. The Medici dukes, with the fall of the Republic Clement, ensured that the Medici would rule Florence as hereditary dukes. The age of republican government was over. Florence, once celebrated for its civic independence, became a dynastic state under Medici control. This transformation marked a decisive shift. The family that had once carefully cloaked its power beneath the institutions of a republic no longer needed such disguises. They were now recognized as sovereign rulers, with imperial backing to secure their dynasty. For Florence's republican tradition, it was a bitter end. But for the Medici, it was the fulfillment of an ambition long pursued in shadows. Clement's final years. Though Clement had restored his family's power, his papacy remained overshadowed by disaster. The Protestant Reformation continued to spread, unchecked across northern Europe. His failure to contain it stood in stark contrast to the grandeur of his predecessor, Leo XI Clement, devoted his later years to strengthening Medici fortunes, particularly through the marriage of his niece Catherine. In 1533, Catherine married Henry, Duke of Orléans, who would later become King Henry II of France. This union would one day make her Queen of France, and from her would spring 3 French kings. In 1534, Clement VII died. His papacy was remembered as one of calamity, the sack of Rome, the loss of prestige, the deepening of the Reformation. Yet for the Medici family, his reign secured something priceless, the permanent establishment of their rule in Florence and the planting of their bloodline in French royalty. Florence transformed. With the Republic destroyed, Florence entered a new era under Medici dukes. The city that had once prided itself on liberty now bowed to dynastic rule. Yet even under princely power, Florence remained a beacon of art and culture, for the Medici continued to invest in beauty as a means of legitimizing their reign. The Medici candle, though singed by the fires of Rome and the storms of politics, still burned. But as the family grew from bankers to dukes, and from dukes to royal in-laws of Europe, their ambitions reached ever higher. Ahead lay new chapters of magnificence, intrigue, and bloodshed. The Medici had survived exile, conspiracy, and catastrophe. They had endured the humiliation of seeing Rome pillaged and Florence rebel. Yet by the cunning of Clement VII and the might of the Habsburg Empire, they emerged not just restored, but transformed, princes of Florence and kin to the kings of France. The next generation would carry this legacy further, building the foundations of Medici princely power while navigating the dangerous currents of Renaissance politics. But even as they rose, new challenges awaited: assassinations, rivalries, and the struggles of power that never ceased in Italy's turbulent heart. A new Medici era, The fall of the Florentine Republic in 1530 marked the beginning of an entirely new chapter in the Medici saga. Florence was no longer a republic balancing oligarchic families and civic ideals. It had become a dynastic state, molded in the image of European monarchies. And at its head, chosen by Pope Clement VII and sanctioned by Emperor Charles V, stood Alessandro de' Medici. His ascent was both a triumph for the family and a scandal, for Alessandro was no ordinary heir. His parentage, his character, and his fate would make him one of the most controversial rulers in Florence's history. The question of birth. Alessandro was born in 1510 under a cloud of speculation. His mother was a servant woman of African descent named Simonetta da Colivecchio. His father, however, was disputed. Some claimed he was the illegitimate son of Lorenzo II de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, and therefore grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Others whispered that his true father was none other than Pope Clement VII himself, who, before taking holy orders, had been known to keep close company with women. This uncertain origin gave Alessandro an unusual position. On one hand, he carried Medici blood, linking him to the dynasty that now ruled Florence. On the other, his mixed-race heritage and illegitimacy made him a target of scorn among Florentine elites. Opponents derisively referred to him as Il Moro, a reference to his darker complexion. But in Renaissance politics, bloodlines were less important than the will of the powerful, and Clement VII was determined that Alessandro would rule. The imperial alliance to secure Alessandro's authority, Clement turned again to Emperor Charles V. The emperor, who had already restored the Medici to Florence through military force, agreed to recognize Alessandro as Duke of Florence. In return, Clement further tightened Medici Habsburg ties by arranging Alessandro's marriage to Margaret of Austria, Charles V's illegitimate daughter. With the emperor's blessing and papal authority behind him, Alessandro's position seemed unassailable. Florence was no longer a fragile republic. It was a principality backed by the two greatest powers in Christendom. But within the city, walls, discontent smoldered. Ruled by fear and excess, Alessandro's rule quickly gained notoriety. Contemporary accounts, often penned by his enemies, described him as tyrannical, debauched, and given to excess. He relied heavily on imperial troops to keep order and showed little regard for Florence's republican traditions. Many accused him of cruelty. Stories circulated of executions, imprisonments, and the silencing of dissent. But what most inflamed the Florentine imagination were the tales of his personal conduct. Rumors spread that Alessandro used his position to seduce or coerce women of noble families, breaking into homes under cover of night or luring them under false pretenses. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories painted him as a despot, not only in politics but also in private life. For Florentine patricians, long accustomed to wielding influence in civic councils, Alessandro's behavior was an outrage. The Medici had once been masters of subtle power, cloaking their dominance in the language of liberty. Alessandro abandoned all pretense. He ruled as a prince, and for many in Florence that was intolerable. Enemies within among those who despised Alessandro were members of his own family. The Medici clan, though united in outward power, was riddled with rivalries. The most dangerous of Alessandro's enemies was a distant cousin, Lorenzino de' Medici. Lorenzino, a young man of noble birth but restless ambition, initially ingratiated himself with Alessandro. He became part of the Duke's inner circle, accompanying him on hunts, feasts, and entertainments. But beneath this mask of loyalty, Lorenzino seethed with resentment. Like many Florentines, he despised the loss of the Republic. He also saw Alessandro as unworthy of ruling the great city of Florence. Lorenzino began to plot not only against the Duke, but against the very principle of Medici despotism. The assassination of Alessandro. The climax came on the night of January 6, 1537. Alessandro, then only 26 years old, was lured by Lorenzino to a private apartment under the pretense of meeting a woman. Trusting his cousin, Alessandro came unguarded, leaving behind his usual retinue. In the secrecy of the chamber, as Alessandro prepared for pleasure, Lorenzino and an accomplice turned on him. With swords and daggers, they struck the Duke down. Alessandro's body was left lifeless on the bed, the blood of the first Medici Duke soaking the sheets. Lorenzino had not merely killed a man, he believed he had struck a blow for Florence itself. In his mind, he was another Brutus, avenging the liberty of Rome by slaying a tyrant. After the murder, Lorenzino even penned a treatise justifying his deed, arguing that the assassination of a tyrant was a noble and moral act. But history proved less kind to Lorenzino. Far from restoring the Republic, Alessandro's death plunged Florence into another power struggle, one that would only entrench Medici rule more firmly than ever. The rise of Cosimo de' Medici, the assassination of Alessandro, left Florence in chaos. Who would rule now? Some called for the restoration of the Republic, while others argued for another Medici successor. The city's powerful factions debated furiously, each fearing the intervention of Emperor Charles V, whose daughter had been Alessandro's widow. In the end, the Medici family rallied behind an unexpected candidate, Cosimo de' Medici, a distant relative only 17 years old, with little experience in politics. Many elites supported Cosimo precisely because they thought he would be weak and easy to control, a pliable figurehead, while real power rested in their hands. But they had gravely underestimated him. Florence at a turning point. Thus ended the brief, tumultuous reign of Alessandro de' Medici, the first Duke of Florence, a ruler remembered for scandal, excess, and a shocking death at the hands of his own kin. His assassination might have ended Medici power once and for all, had events unfolded differently. Instead, it became the prelude to a new and far more enduring chapter, the rise of Cosimo I, one of the most formidable rulers in Florence's history. In the years to come, Cosimo would prove himself no puppet, but a master strategist who would consolidate Medici power as never before. Under him, the family's dominion would be transformed into a grand duchy recognized across Europe, and Florence would enter yet another phase of its remarkable saga. But this triumph would not come easily. The city was still divided, republican. Exiles plotted revenge, and the memory of Alessandro's tyranny lingered like a shadow. Florence stood at a crossroads, and the young Cosimo would have to navigate treachery, diplomacy, and war to secure the destiny of his house. A teenage duke, when Alessandro de' Medici's body was discovered lifeless in 1537, Florence was plunged into uncertainty. The assassination had removed the first duke, but it had not solved the larger question. What political shape would the city take? Would Florence reclaim its republican identity, or would the Medici dynasty endure? The answer came swiftly. Florence's leading families, fearful of imperial reprisals and eager to retain some control, looked to another Medici. Their choice was unexpected: Cosimo, a 17-year-old from a relatively junior branch of the family. He was the son of Giovanni dalle Bandinere, the famed condottiero, and Maria Salviati, herself a descendant of Lorenzo the Magnificent. The oligarchs believed they had found the perfect solution. Young, inexperienced, and isolated, Cosimo seemed an ideal puppet ruler, a Medici in name who could be manipulated while the patricians restored their own influence behind the scenes. But the boy they underestimated would soon prove himself sharper, harder, and far more ambitious than anyone had imagined. The challenge of Montemurlo barely. Months after Cosimo's appointment, the first great test came. The Republican exiles, many of whom had fled after the Medici restoration in 1530, saw Alessandro's assassination as a divine opportunity. Led by Filippo Strozzi, a wealthy banker and head of the proud Strozzi family, they assembled an army of mercenaries, hoping to march on Florence and topple the Medici once and for all. Their plan culminated in the Battle of Montemurlo in August 1537. Cosimo, though young, acted decisively. He secured imperial backing from Emperor Charles V and gathered troops loyal to the Medici cause. When the two forces clashed, Cosimo's men crushed the rebels. The battle was short but decisive, and the aftermath brutal. Filippo Strozzi was captured, imprisoned, and later found dead in his cell, officially a suicide, though many suspected otherwise. Dozens of Republican leaders were executed or exiled, their hopes for a restored republic extinguished. Montemurlo marked the definitive end of Florence's Republican tradition. Never again would the city rise against Medici rule in serious force. The shaping of a Prince Montemurlo established Cosimo's authority, but he knew military victory alone was not enough. He set about reshaping Florence into a state where no such rebellion could ever threaten him again. Unlike his predecessors, who cloaked their power in republican language, Cosimo abandoned all pretense. He ruled openly as a prince, consolidating authority in his own hands. He reorganized the government, stripping the councils of real influence and centralizing decision-making in ducal offices. He built a network of loyal administrators drawn not from Florence's entrenched patricians, but from new men whose fortunes depended entirely on his favor. He imposed taxes with ruthless efficiency, ensuring the Medici coffers grew even as resentment simmered. Yet Cosimo was not merely a despot. He understood the importance of legitimacy and prestige. He cultivated the image of a ruler who defended Florence's honor, safeguarded its prosperity, and restored its glory. To the people, he presented himself as a fatherly figure, strict but protective. To foreign powers, he was a shrewd negotiator who would elevate Florence's standing among Europe's states. A marriage of power. Cosimo's greatest diplomatic triumph came through marriage. In 1539, he wed Eleonora of Toledo, the daughter of the Spanish Viceroy of Naples. The union was more than personal, it was political. By allying himself with one of Spain's most powerful families, Cosimo secured the goodwill of Emperor Charles V, ensuring imperial support for his rule. Eleonora herself became a formidable partner. She brought with her immense wealth, which Cosimo used to strengthen his state. She also provided him with a large brood of children, ensuring the continuation of the Medici line. The ducal couple projected an image of stability and prosperity, one that contrasted sharply with the scandalous reign of Alessandro. The fortress of power. Cosimo also understood the power of architecture as a political tool. He moved the ducal residence from the Medici Palace on Via Larga to the more imposing Palazzo Vecchio, symbolically placing himself at the heart of Florence's civic identity. Yet he also began the construction of a new residence, the Palazzo Pitti, across the Arno, which, under Eleonora's guidance, became a grand seat of Medici power. Equally significant was his emphasis on military defense. Cosimo fortified the city, strengthened its walls, and commissioned the construction of new strongholds throughout Tuscany. He wanted to ensure that Florence would never again be vulnerable to external invasion or internal rebellion. Expanding beyond Florence under Cosimo, Florence's horizons expanded beyond its walls. He sought to extend Medici control over the entire Tuscan region, gradually transforming his duchy into a territorial state. In 1555, with the backing of Spain, Cosimo conquered Siena after a long and brutal war. The annexation of Siena was a watershed moment, doubling the size of his dominion and securing Florence's dominance in central Italy. The conquest was not easy. Siena resisted fiercely, supported by French allies, and endured a devastating siege that reduced its population and left scars that would linger for generations. But once victory was secured, Cosimo showed no mercy. He dismantled Siena's independence, absorbed its lands, and cemented his reputation as a ruler who combined patience with ruthless determination. Recognition as Grand Duke Cosimo's ambition did not stop at mere territorial control. He wanted international recognition of his power, something that would elevate the Medici above their rivals and place them on par with Europe's great dynasties. That recognition came in 1569, when Pope Pius V granted him the title of Grand Duke of Tuscany. This was more than ceremonial. It signaled to the world that the Medici were no longer local lords of a fractious city. They were sovereign rulers of a unified Tuscan state. Florence, once a republic ruled from behind the scenes by bankers, had become the heart of a princely realm, with the Medici dynasty at its core. The legacy of Cosimo I Cosimo. I reigned for nearly 4 decades, longer than any previous Medici ruler. He transformed Florence politically, militarily, and culturally. Though his rule was marked by authoritarianism, he gave the state stability after generations of turbulence. He also continued the Medici tradition of patronage. Under his watch, Giorgio Vasari created the Uffizi, initially designed as government offices, but later transformed into one of the world's greatest art galleries. Cosimo commissioned grand works that reinforced the image of Florence as a city of power and culture. Yet his reign also left behind bitterness. Republican ideals were crushed, dissent was punished, and the independence of Florence, once celebrated across Europe, was extinguished. The Medici had traded the language of liberty for the trappings of monarchy. By the time of his death in 1574, Cosimo I had secured the dynasty's place as rulers of Tuscany. His descendants would inherit not just Florence, but an entire state, one recognized by popes and emperors alike. The Medici, once bankers in a fragile republic, were now sovereign princes with a dynasty that seemed unshakable. But history, as always, had more trials in store. The burden of succession. When Cosimo I died in 1574, he left behind a legacy of iron-fisted rule and state-building that had reshaped Florence forever. His son and heir, Francesco de' Medici, stepped into this inheritance. But where Cosimo had been pragmatic, disciplined, and politically astute, Francesco was a man of very different temperament. Francesco had little interest in governance or war. His heart lay elsewhere, in the world of science, alchemy, and private pleasure. While Florence needed a ruler with the steel of his father, it instead received a prince absorbed in experiments and indulgence. His reign would be one of intrigue, scandal, and whispers of murder, casting a shadow over the Medici name. Francesco I and his obsessions. Francesco was fascinated by the natural sciences. He spent hours in his laboratories at the Palazzo Vecchio, surrounded by flasks, minerals, and the tools of alchemy. He dabbled in chemistry, metallurgy, and the search for the philosopher's stone, the legendary substance said to turn base metals into gold. He was also a collector, amassing natural curiosities, rare stones, and exotic artifacts that would later form part of Florence's celebrated scientific collections. In some ways, Francesco's passion reflected the Renaissance spirit of inquiry. He supported artists, scientists, and thinkers, including the young Galileo Galilei, whose astronomical discoveries would shake the world. Yet for many Florentines, a duke who preferred distillation flasks to councils of state seemed detached, even negligent. The shadow of Bianca Capello. If Francesco's scientific experiments raised eyebrows, his personal life scandalized Florence. Outright, he was married to Joanna of Austria, a Habsburg princess, in a union that had been carefully arranged for political purposes. But Francesco's affections lay elsewhere, with Bianca Capello, a Venetian noblewoman who had fled to Florence after eloping with a clerk. Bianca became Francesco's mistress and later his wife, a move that shocked not only Florence but also the courts of Europe. The marriage to a runaway Venetian woman was seen as unworthy of a Medici Grand Duke, and it strained relations with the powerful Habsburgs. Within Florence, Bianca was viewed with suspicion, accused of scheming and manipulation, and blamed for driving a wedge between Francesco and his legitimate family. The court became a place of gossip and rivalry, with factions forming around Bianca and Joanna. The tension turned deadly when Joanna died in 1578, officially from childbirth complications. Rumors spread that Bianca had arranged her rival's demise through poison. These whispers only grew when a few years later, Francesco himself died. Suddenly in 1587, along with Bianca. Officially, both deaths were attributed to malaria, but many suspected darker causes. Some pointed to poison. Others suggested Francesco's own brother, Ferdinando, who stood to inherit the duchy, had orchestrated their end. To this day, forensic examinations of their remains have fueled debate, with traces of arsenic found in their bodies, though the evidence remains contested. Whatever the truth, the sudden deaths of Francesco and Bianca left behind an aura of mystery and scandal, one of the darkest chapters in the Medici story. Ferdinando I, the cardinal turned Grand Duke. With Francesco's death, power passed to Ferdinando I de' Medici, Francesco's younger brother. Ferdinando had been a cardinal in Rome, never expected to rule Florence. Yet the sudden turn of events brought him from the church into the role of Grand Duke, and he proved to be an unexpectedly capable leader. Where Francesco had been distracted and reclusive, Ferdinando was pragmatic and outward-looking. He set about repairing the Medici reputation, reasserting Florence's place in European politics, and governing with a mix of firmness and moderation. He abandoned his cardinal's life without hesitation, marrying Christine of Lorraine, a granddaughter of Catherine de' Medici, thereby reinforcing dynastic ties with French royalty. Trade, commerce, and the Tuscan navy, Ferdinando understood that Florence and Tuscany could not rival the great continental powers militarily, but they could excel through trade and maritime influence. He invested heavily in developing the port city of Livorno, transforming it into a thriving hub of Mediterranean commerce. One of his boldest policies was the creation of the Leggi Livornine, Livornese laws, which offered religious and commercial freedom to merchants of all backgrounds, including Jews and Protestants fleeing persecution elsewhere in Europe. In an age of religious intolerance, this policy was revolutionary. It turned Livorno into a cosmopolitan city, attracting traders from across the Mediterranean and beyond, enriching Tuscany's coffers. Ferdinando also established the Order of St. Stephen, a military and religious order dedicated to combating Ottoman pirates and defending Christian shipping routes. Under his leadership, Tuscan galleys patrolled the seas, striking blows against corsairs and securing prestige for the Medici state. Patronage and piety. Though a pragmatic ruler, Ferdinando did not abandon the Medici tradition of patronage. He supported the arts and sciences, continuing to fund projects that enriched Florence's cultural life. He commissioned the construction of new churches and public works, leaving behind monuments that spoke to both piety and power. Yet he was also careful to balance grandeur with modesty. Unlike Francesco's court, marked by excess and scandal, Ferdinando's reign projected stability, discipline, and respectability. He strengthened the Medici position in Europe not through alchemical experiments or scandalous marriages, but through careful diplomacy and practical governance. Legacy of two brothers, the contrasting reigns of Francesco I and Ferdinando. I revealed the dual faces of the Medici legacy. Francesco embodied the darker, more secretive side of the dynasty, a fascination with hidden knowledge, scandalous love affairs, and sudden mysterious deaths. His reign fed the rumors and legends that have long clung to the Medici name, giving fuel to tales of poison, intrigue, and corruption. Ferdinando, in contrast, represented the stabilizing force of the family, pragmatic, diplomatic, and focused on the prosperity of Tuscany as a whole. Under him, the Medici secured their place not just as rulers of Florence, but as significant players in Mediterranean trade and European politics. By the time Ferdinando died in 1609, he had left behind a stronger, more respected duchy, even as the darker shadows of Francesco's reign still haunted Florentine memory. The Medici dynasty was entering a new century, one that would see both continued splendor and gradual decline. For even as the family clung to power, the challenges of Europe, shifting alliances, wars of religion, and the rise of modern states would test the resilience of a dynasty that had once dominated through banking and subtle influence, but now relied on titles, territory, and tradition. Cosimo VII and the weight of expectation. When Ferdinando Vist died in 1609, the Grand Ducal throne passed to his son, Cosimo II de' Medici. At just 19, Cosimo VII inherited not only his father's duchy, but also the burden of maintaining the family's reputation at a time when Europe was entering an age of turbulence, wars of religion, shifting alliances, and the slow transformation from Renaissance courts to early modern states. Cosimo II was not a robust man. Frail in health, often bedridden with illness, he lacked the military energy of his grandfather Cosimo I, or the pragmatic steadiness of his father. Yet he was not without strengths. He had inherited the Medici love of learning, and under his reign, Florence became a vital center for the new science that was sweeping across Europe. Patronage of Galileo. The brightest star in Cosimo II's circle was Galileo Galilei. The famed scientist, born in Pisa in 1564, had already begun making waves with his revolutionary studies in mathematics, physics, and astronomy. In 1610, Galileo published Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, a work that unveiled discoveries made with his newly improved telescope. Mountains on the moon, countless stars invisible to the naked eye, and most controversially, the moons of Jupiter. Galileo named these moons the Medicean stars in honor of Cosimo II and his brothers. The dedication was no accident. It tied Galileo's scientific breakthroughs to Medici prestige. In return, Cosimo appointed Galileo as court mathematician and philosopher, giving him both patronage and protection. This relationship placed Florence at the center of the scientific revolution. Galileo's discoveries challenged centuries of Aristotelian belief and shook the foundations of the Catholic worldview. With Medici support, Galileo was able to expand his work, but he also drew the attention and eventually the wrath of the Church. For the Medici, the association with Galileo was both a blessing and a burden, a source of glory as Florence became linked to groundbreaking knowledge, but also a potential danger as Galileo's heliocentric theories collided with religious orthodoxy. The struggle for stability while Galileo's star rose, Cosimo II's government faced more earthly concerns. Tuscany was a small state surrounded by greater powers, Spain, France, the Papal States, and the Habsburg Empire. Maintaining independence required careful diplomacy, and Cosimo II leaned heavily on advisors and his formidable mother, Christine of Lorraine, who often acted as a stabilizing force. Cosimo's reign did not produce great wars or conquests like his grandfather's, but it did preserve the fragile security of the duchy. He continued the development of Livorno, expanding its free port status and strengthening Tuscany's role in Mediterranean trade. Yet his personal weakness and poor health meant the Medici court was increasingly reliant on committees, regents and relatives to keep the machinery of government running. By the time Cosimo II died in 1621, at the age of just 30, he left behind not a legacy of conquest or reform, but one of fragile continuity. His son, Ferdinando II, was only 10 years old. Tuscany once again entered a period where the survival of the Medici dynasty depended on the regency of strong-willed women. The regency of Christina of Lorraine and Maria Maddalena of Austria. The young Ferdinando II's minority placed Florence under the joint regency of his grandmother, Christine of Lorraine, and his mother, Maria Maddalena of Austria. These two women effectively ruled Tuscany for over a decade, shaping the duchy through their own perspectives. Their regency was deeply religious and conservative. The influence of the Counter-Reformation was strong, and both women ensured Florence remained a devoutly Catholic court. They restricted certain intellectual freedoms, tightened censorship, and steered Tuscan policy into alignment with Rome and Spain. Yet they also managed to preserve stability in difficult times. The 30 Years' War raged across Europe, devastating vast regions, but Tuscany avoided direct involvement, thanks to the cautious diplomacy of the regency. Still, the duchy's cautious neutrality came at a price. Florence's international prestige diminished, and its role in European politics became more passive. Ferdinando II. A duke in a changing world, when Ferdinando II de' Medici came of age, he inherited a duchy that was secure but stagnant. His reign, beginning in the 1630s, reflected the larger decline of Medici power. Tuscany was no longer the vigorous, expanding state of Cosimo I's day. Instead, it was a cautious, secondary power, overshadowed by the giants of Europe. Yet Ferdinando II did leave his mark in the realm of science and culture. He continued his family's support of Galileo, even during the scientist's infamous trial before the Inquisition in 1633. Though Galileo was forced to recant his heliocentric beliefs and live under house arrest, Ferdinando's patronage allowed him to continue his studies in relative safety. Ferdinando also fostered other intellectual endeavors, encouraging experimental science and maintaining Florence's role as a hub of innovation. In 1657, he and his brother Prince Leopoldo founded the Accademia del Cimento, Academy of Experiment, one of Europe's first scientific societies. Its motto, Provando e riprovando, by testing and retesting, captured the spirit of the new scientific method. Yet while science flourished, politics faltered. Tuscany's economy stagnated, burdened by taxation and declining trade. The once mighty Tuscan navy dwindled, and Florence increasingly withdrew from Mediterranean affairs. The Medici court became more insular, more devoted to spectacle than to statecraft. The cultural splendor of decline, even as political power waned, cultural life retained its brilliance. Ferdinando II's court remained a center for music, theater, and the visual arts. The Medici sponsored grand festivals, theatrical performances, and architectural projects that dazzled visitors. The family's obsession with magnificence reached new heights in the staging of elaborate court spectacles, masks, ballets, and operas that blended music, painting, and stagecraft into a unified art form. These events were not merely entertainment. They were political theater, designed to project Medici prestige even as real power slipped away. In many ways, the 17th century Medici exemplified the paradox of decline, politically weaker yet culturally radiant, like a star burning brightly, Before it fades, the Medici Duchy dazzled Europe with art and science, even as its foundations began to crumble. The cracks begin to show by the mid-17th century. It was clear that the Medici were no longer the vigorous dynasty of old. Their marriages increasingly brought in less powerful connections. Their treasuries struggled with debts, and their politics were reactive rather than visionary. The population of Florence and Tuscany stagnated, plagued by outbreaks of plague and economic malaise. The once bustling Florentine banks had long since faded, replaced by newer financial powers in Amsterdam and London. The Mediterranean, once the stage of Tuscan galleys, was now dominated by larger states with global reach. Ferdinando II's reign ended in 1670, passing the title to his son, Cosimo III de' Medici, a man whose eccentricities, religiosity, and mismanagement would accelerate the dynasty's decline. But before diving into Cosimo III's long and troubled reign, it is worth pausing on this moment in Medici history. The 17th century saw Florence shift from the center of Renaissance innovation and Republican memory to a princely court, brilliant in art but increasingly irrelevant in politics. The Medici had climbed from bankers to dukes, to grand dukes, and finally to patrons of science that would change the world. Yet the price of glory was stagnation, and the cracks in their power were beginning to spread. The longest reign in 1670, Cosimo III de' Medici inherited the Grand Duchy from his father, Ferdinando II. His reign would last an astonishing 53 years, the longest of any Medici ruler. Yet longevity did not bring glory. Instead, Cosimo's rule marked one of the most troubled and declining eras in Medici history. Where earlier Medici dukes had balanced politics with patronage, Cosimo III was consumed by piety, moral rigidity, and personal eccentricity. His reign was dominated by religious fervor, social repression, and financial mismanagement. Tuscany, once a proud duchy, slid further into stagnation and obscurity. A man obsessed with religion, Cosimo III was deeply, almost fanatically, devout. His court reflected the spirit of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, where every detail of life was infused with ritual and piety. The Grand Duke spent long hours in prayer, wore penitential garments, and often attended multiple masses each day. This religiosity extended into his governance. He imposed strict moral codes on Florence and Tuscany, cracking down on behaviors he deemed sinful. Laws restricted personal freedoms, enforced censorship, and punished perceived immorality. Taverns were regulated, gambling suppressed, and even personal dress came under scrutiny. For many Florentines, this suffocating atmosphere drained the city of its old vibrancy. The dazzling spectacles of Ferdinando II's court gave way to an environment of gloom and restraint. The joyous culture of Renaissance Florence seemed a distant memory. Decline of the economy. At the same time, Tuscany's economic troubles deepened. The Medici treasury was burdened with debts, and Cosimo III had little skill in financial management. Agriculture stagnated, trade declined, and the once proud Tuscan navy was reduced to insignificance. Livorno, once a thriving free port under Ferdinando the Firm, struggled to maintain its vitality. The broader Mediterranean economy had shifted, with Atlantic powers like England, France, and the Dutch Republic dominating global trade. Tuscany, landlocked in ambition and small in resources, was left behind. Cosimo's heavy taxation only worsened matters, driving merchants away and placing a crushing burden on the population. Tuscany became increasingly poor, its rural areas depopulated, its urban centers languishing. A miserable marriage. Cosimo III's personal life was equally bleak. In 1661, before becoming Grand Duke, he had married Marguerite Louise d'Orléans, a French princess and cousin of Louis XIV. The union was meant to strengthen Medici ties to the powerful French monarchy. Instead, it turned into a disaster. Marguerite Louise despised Florence, despised Tuscany, and despised her husband. The marriage was marked by constant quarrels, bitterness, and open hostility. Marguerite complained bitterly about Florentine society, calling it provincial and dull, compared to the glittering court of Versailles. Eventually, the marriage collapsed entirely. In 1675, after years of acrimony, Marguerite Louise left Florence and returned to France, effectively abandoning her role as Grand Duchess. She lived in Paris until her death, while Cosimo III remained in Florence, humiliated and embittered. The separation left a deep mark on Cosimo, who grew ever more withdrawn and fanatically religious. It also fractured the Medici dynasty's image in Europe, revealing the dysfunction at the heart of the family. His children, scandal and despair. If Cosimo hoped his children would secure the Medici line, he was sorely disappointed. His three children, Ferdinando, Giangastone, and Anna Maria Luisa, brought more scandal than stability. Ferdinando de' Medici, the eldest son and heir, was a flamboyant figure, known for his extravagant tastes, love of music, and scandalous relationships. Openly homosexual in an era when it was dangerous to be so, Ferdinando clashed constantly with his father's Puritanism. He spent lavishly on entertainment and patronized the arts, but his personal life was a source of embarrassment. To secure the dynasty, he was married to Violante Beatrice of Bavaria, but the union produced no children. Ferdinando died of syphilis in 1713, leaving the Medici succession in crisis. Giangastone de' Medici, the second son, was even more troubled. Forced into a marriage with Anna Maria Francisca of Saxe-Lauenburg, he found himself trapped in a loveless, hostile union. Giangastone loathed his wife and lived most of his life in misery, retreating into melancholy and indulgence. When he eventually became Grand Duke after his father's death, he ruled listlessly, a symbol of the Medici's decline. Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, Cosimo's only daughter, was perhaps the most competent of the three. Intelligent and cultured, she married Johann Wilhelm, Elector Palatine of the Holy Roman Empire, strengthening Medici ties to Germany. Yet the marriage, too, was childless, and after her husband's death she returned to Florence, where she would play a crucial role in preserving the Medici legacy through the Patto di Famiglia, family pact. Cosimo's obsession with succession. As the years dragged on, Cosimo III grew increasingly desperate about the Medici succession. With his eldest son dead and Giangastone showing no interest in fathering heirs, the dynasty faced extinction. Cosimo petitioned European courts and the papacy to recognize his daughter Anna Maria Luisa as a legitimate heir. But in a patriarchal Europe, female succession to Tuscany was unacceptable. This looming crisis became a political chess piece in European diplomacy. Foreign powers eyed Tuscany as a potential prize, and the Medici, once feared and respected, were now pawns in a larger game. The image of a dying dynasty. By the time Cosimo III died in 1723, Tuscany was a shadow of its former self. The once proud duchy had become impoverished and stagnant, its population shrinking, its influence reduced to insignificance. Florence, once the beating heart of the Renaissance, now seemed like a museum of past glories, preserved but lifeless. Cosimo's personal legacy was one of austerity, repression, and decline. He left behind a family fractured by scandal, without clear heirs, and with little hope for revival. To many Florentines, he was a tragic symbol of how far the Medici had fallen, from Cosimo, the elder's cunning banking empire, and Lorenzo, the magnificent's golden court, to a weary duchy suffocating under religious fervor and economic despair. Giangastone. Torch now passed to his son, Giangastone de' Medici, a reluctant ruler whose reign would be brief and sorrowful, but whose death would mark the end of the Medici dynasty itself. A reluctant ruler, when Cosimo III de' Medici died in 1723, the Grand Ducal title passed to his surviving son, Gian Gastone de' Medici. Born in 1671, Gian Gastone was already over 50 years old when he ascended the throne. Unlike his predecessors, he had no interest in power, no appetite for grandeur, and no energy for governance. Gian Gastone's life before his accession had been one of deep unhappiness. His arranged marriage to Anna Maria Francisca of Saxe-Lauenburg had been a disaster. The couple loathed one another from the beginning. She was domineering, temperamental, and infamously cruel. He was reserved, intellectual, and indifferent to her. Gian Gastone abandoned her almost immediately after the wedding, retreating to Prague and later to Florence, refusing to share her household. Their union produced no children, sealing the dynasty's fate. By the time he became Grand Duke, Gian Gastone was a weary man, embittered by personal failure, isolated, and increasingly dependent on drink and companions of ill repute. The new ruler of Tuscany was hardly the image of a powerful prince. The shadow of decay Gian Gastone's court was a reflection of his personality, withdrawn, sombre, and stripped of the grandeur that had once dazzled Europe. Unlike his father, who cloaked decline in religious pomp, Gian Gastone abandoned much of the ceremonial life of Florence. He rarely appeared in public, preferring to remain in seclusion. His companions were a circle of hangers-on and flatterers, many from the lower ranks of society, known mockingly as the Ruspanti, named after the small copper coins they were often given by the Duke. These figures entertained him, but scandalized Florentine elites, who viewed the court as degraded and unworthy of the Medici name. Florence itself mirrored this sense of decline. The city, once vibrant with merchants, artists, and scholars, had become a quieter, poorer place. Its economy remained stagnant, its population shrinking. Visitors described Florence as a museum of Renaissance glories, a city living off its past rather than forging a future. A surprising act of reform, yet Gian Gastone, for all his weaknesses, was not entirely without merit as a ruler. Unlike his father, he had little interest in enforcing strict religious codes or punishing personal freedoms. In fact, he repealed many of Cosimo III's most repressive laws, easing censorship and reducing moral policing. Where his father had stifled society with piety, Gian Gastone allowed a measure of liberty to return. Taverns reopened, gambling restrictions loosened, and Florence slowly regained a sense of social life. The Grand Duke himself cared little for outward appearances, which paradoxically made his reign more tolerable for ordinary citizens. Still, these modest reforms could not reverse decades of economic stagnation or political decline. Tuscany remained a minor power overshadowed by the ambitions of larger European states. The question of succession as Gian Gastone grew older, it became increasingly clear that the Medici line was doomed. With no children and with his elder brother Ferdinando already dead, the dynasty faced extinction. The only remaining Medici of note was his sister Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, who had returned to Florence after the death of her husband, Johann Wilhelm, of the Palatinate. Anna Maria Luisa, intelligent and politically astute, tried to secure recognition as heir to Tuscany. Yet just as Cosimo III had discovered, Europe would not accept a woman as ruler of the duchy. Tuscany's fate would instead be decided by the great powers of Europe. Even before Gian Gastone's death, foreign courts were maneuvering for control of Florence. The War of the Spanish Succession and later the War of the Polish Succession had redrawn the map of Europe, and Tuscany was treated as a bargaining chip. The candidate chosen by the European powers to inherit the duchy was Francis Stephen of Lorraine, who would later become Holy Roman Emperor alongside his wife, Maria Theresa of Austria. In other words, the Medici state, born of banking, nurtured in Renaissance brilliance and raised to ducal heights by cunning and ruthlessness, was now reduced to a pawn in continental diplomacy. The last years, by the late 1720s, Gian Gaston's health had collapsed. Obese, plagued by illness, and sinking into melancholy, he spent his final years largely bedridden. Visitors to the court described him as a broken man, consumed by regret and disinterest in life. He died on 9th July 1737, at the age of 66. With his death, the male line of the Medici family ended after nearly 3 centuries of rule over Florence and Tuscany. The people of Florence, though not grieving deeply for Gian Gaston himself, mourned the passing of the Medici dynasty. For all their flaws, the Medici had given Florence its golden age, its art, its architecture, its legacy of brilliance. Now that chapter had closed. The family pact, preserving the legacy. The final act of the Medici dynasty did not come with Gian Gaston, but with his sister Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici. Though she could not inherit the duchy, she ensured that the Medici legacy would endure. In 1737, just after her brother's death, she signed the Patto di Famiglia, family pact, with the new rulers of Tuscany, the House of Lorraine. In this agreement, Anna Maria Luisa stipulated that the vast artistic treasures of the Medici, the paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, jewels and collections accumulated over centuries, must remain in Florence for the use of the public and to attract the curiosity of foreigners. This pact prevented the dispersion of the Medici collections across Europe, preserving the Uffizi Gallery, the Pitti Palace, and countless other treasures as permanent fixtures of Florence. To this day, much of what tourists marvel at in Florence, Botticelli's Birth of Venus, Michelangelo's works, Raphael's portraits, the Medici jewels, remains there because of Anna Maria Luisa's foresight, the end of an era with Gian Gaston's death and the arrival of the Lorraines. Tuscany entered a new chapter under foreign rulers. Yet the Medici name lingered, woven into the very fabric of Florence. Streets, churches, palaces, and museums bore witness to their centuries of influence. The dynasty that began with Cosimo the Elder, banking its way into power, and reached its zenith with Lorenzo the Magnificent, had ended not with a dramatic fall, but with a slow fading into irrelevance. Their story was one of triumphs and tragedies, of ruthless ambition and glittering patronage, of glory and decay. As the bells of Florence tolled in July 1737, the Medici, as rulers, were gone. But as symbols, as patrons of art and architects of Renaissance brilliance, they would never be forgotten. A foreign dynasty takes the throne. When Gian Gaston de' Medici died in 1737 without an heir, Tuscany became the prize of European diplomacy. The great powers, Austria, France, Spain, and Britain, had long treated smaller Italian states as bargaining chips in their contests for dominance. Florence, though diminished, still had symbolic value. By prior agreement, Tuscany was assigned to Francis Stephen of Lorraine, a duke from northeastern France. Though he had no connection to the Medici by blood, his marriage to Maria Theresa of Austria, heiress to the Habsburg dominions, ensured that Tuscany would fall into the vast web of Habsburg influence. Thus, the House of Lorraine succeeded the Medici, beginning a new chapter in Florentine history. The Lorraines ruled Tuscany until the Napoleonic upheavals of the late 18th century, and then again in the 19th century until Italian unification. Yet their rule was always seen as foreign, imposed upon Florence by outside powers. For many Florentines, the Medici, with all their faults, had at least been their dynasty. The Lorraines, by contrast, were strangers, pragmatic rulers, but without the deep roots of the Medici legacy. Anna Maria Luisa's final gift, the transition from Medici to Lorraine, might have meant the loss of Florence's greatest treasures. Throughout Europe, it was common practice for new dynasties to strip conquered lands of their wealth, carrying away paintings, jewels, and relics to their own capitals. But Anna Maria Luisa de Medici, the last surviving member of the family, foresaw this danger. Living in semi-retirement in Florence, she used what power remained to her to secure a remarkable agreement, the Patto di Famiglia. In this pact, signed with the Lorraines, she ensured that all the Medici collections, the art, manuscripts, libraries and treasures amassed over centuries, would remain in Florence forever. They were not to be removed, sold or dispersed, but kept for the ornament of the state, for the benefit of the public, and to attract the curiosity of foreigners. This decision transformed Florence. Instead of losing its treasures, the city became a living museum of Renaissance culture. The Uffizi Gallery, the Pitti Palace, the Medici chapels, and countless churches and villas retained their collections, drawing travelers from across Europe. Anna Maria Luisa died in 1743, only 6 years after her brother Giangastone, marking the true end of the Medici line. But in death, she had safeguarded the family's legacy. Florence as a museum, the 18th century saw the birth of the Grand Tour, where wealthy young aristocrats from Britain, France, and Northern Europe traveled through Italy to experience its ancient ruins and Renaissance wonders. Florence, thanks to Anna Maria Luisa's pact, became a central destination. Visitors marveled at the Medici collections, the frescoes of churches, the palaces that lined the Arno. They saw the city not as a living center of power, but as a preserved, a relic of a glorious past. One English traveler described Florence as a cabinet of wonders, where the shades of the mighty Medici still linger. In a sense, the Medici had achieved a strange immortality. Their dynasty had ended, but their city had become a shrine to their achievements. Tourists who walked through the Uffizi or admired Michelangelo's David were, knowingly or not, paying tribute to the family that had made Florence the jewel of the Renaissance. The double legacy, glory and darkness. Yet alongside admiration came whispers of the darker side of Medici rule. Historians and travelers alike recorded tales of intrigue, poisonings, betrayals, and scandals. The family's rise through banking was remembered as both brilliant and ruthless. Their patronage of art was celebrated, but so too were the excesses of their politics and their willingness to shed blood for power. Writers in the 18th and 19th centuries cast the Medici as archetypal Renaissance princes, simultaneously enlightened patrons and dangerous tyrants. Machiavelli's The Prince, though not dedicated to a Medici, became associated with their name, as if they embodied its lessons of cunning, power, and control. The myth of the Medici was thus twofold. They were heroes of culture, but villains of morality. Florence, their city, was seen as a place where beauty and corruption had walked hand in hand. The Lorraines versus the Medici memory. The Lorraines, practical rulers, tried to modernize Tuscany. They reformed the legal system, encouraged agriculture, and introduced Enlightenment-style governance. Yet no matter what they did, they could not escape the shadow of the Medici. Florentines compared every action of the new rulers to the memory of their old dynasty. The grandeur of Lorenzo the Magnificent, the patronage of Cosimo I, the power of the papal Medici. These memories weighed heavily. The Lorraines, fair or not, seemed grey and foreign in comparison. In fact, some Lorraines resented this constant comparison. They saw Florence's obsession with the Medici past as an obstacle to progress, but there was no erasing the name. The Medici had written themselves so deeply into the fabric of the city that they remained ever present. The Medici as symbols. By the 19th century, as Italy moved toward unification, the Medici were remembered as symbols of Florence's greatness. Poets, historians, and novelists wrote of their triumphs and tragedies, weaving them into a romantic narrative of the Renaissance. Some saw them as visionaries who had made Florence the cradle of modern culture. Others portrayed them as tyrants whose lust for power and secret crimes had doomed their line. But either way, the Medici had transcended history to become legend. Their palaces stood like monuments, their portraits hung in galleries, eyes staring. Across centuries, their bones lay in ornate chapels, their names inscribed in marble. Florence was no longer their city politically, but spiritually it always would be. A dynasty ends, but the story does not. The fall of the Medici in 1737 was not the end of their influence. It was the beginning of their myth. Generations of scholars, artists, and tourists would interpret and reinterpret their story. Were they saviors of Florence or destroyers of liberty? Were they enlightened patrons or ruthless manipulators? The truth, of course, lay somewhere in between. But what was undeniable was this: without the Medici, Florence would not have been the Florence the world knows today. Their dark secrets and shining triumphs were inseparable parts of the same story. The dynasty was gone. The Lorraines ruled. Yet in every brushstroke of Botticelli, in every marble figure of Michelangelo, in every golden dome that gleamed above Florence, the Medici lived on. The Enlightenment view, the Medici as case studies. In the decades following the fall of the Medici dynasty, European intellectuals of the Enlightenment often looked back at the family as examples of how power could be used and misused. Florence, preserved like a time capsule, offered a living laboratory for historians, philosophers, and travelers. Thinkers who visited Tuscany in the mid-18th century noted both the grandeur and the decay the Medici had left behind. They admired Lorenzo the Magnificent as a prince of reason who embodied enlightened values before his time. They praised the family's patronage of science, recalling how Galileo had once looked to the Medici for protection. At the same time, Enlightenment writers criticized the darker Medici rulers. Cosimo III and his successors were viewed as autocrats who stifled liberty. Cosimo III, in particular, was portrayed as a symbol of superstition and decline. His oppressive laws a warning against letting religion dominate governance. Thus, in Enlightenment thought, the Medici became both heroes of progress and villains of tyranny, depending on which member of the family one examined. The Romantic Revival. Medici as tragic figures. By the early 19th century, as Europe entered the Romantic era, the Medici story took on a new life in literature and art. Romantic writers loved tales of passion, betrayal, and downfall, and the Medici provided plenty of material. The murder of Alessandro de' Medici, the poisoning rumors surrounding Francesco and Bianca Capello, the doomed romances of Medici women, all these became fodder for novels, plays, and operas. Florence itself was portrayed as a city haunted by ghosts of the Medici, its streets echoing with their scandals and tragedies. Writers like Lord Byron, Stendhal, and Walter Savage Landor visited Florence and drew inspiration from its Medici past. They saw in the family a mirror of human extremes: beauty and corruption, genius and cruelty, ambition and ruin. For Romantic audiences, the Medici were not just historical figures. They were characters in an ongoing drama, their lives written as though by Shakespeare, filled with intrigue, passion, and tragedy. The birth of the Medici tourist. Trail as the 19th century progressed and travel became more accessible, Florence became one of the crown jewels of the Grand Tour. English, German, and American visitors flocked to the city, armed with guidebooks that highlighted Medici sites. They walked through the Uffizi Gallery, marveling at paintings once held in private Medici collections. They stood in the Medici chapels, gazing at the ornate tombs, imagining the lives of those who rested within. They wandered through the Pitti Palace, which had been transformed into a showcase of dynastic splendor. The Medici name became a point, a way to attract travelers hungry for culture and history. Even in death, the family continued to generate wealth for Florence, now in the form of tourism. The Medici and the rise of nationalism during the 19th century as Italy moved toward unification, the Medici were reinterpreted once again. Nationalist thinkers and politicians looked back on the Renaissance as a time when Italy had led the world in art and culture. The Medici, for all their faults, were seen as guardians of this golden age. Lorenzo the Magnificent was elevated as a national hero, an Italian prince who symbolized intellectual and artistic leadership. Even Cosimo IV, often criticized as a despot, was remembered for uniting Tuscany and strengthening Italian identity. The Medici became part of Italy's cultural nationalism, figures to be celebrated not only as Florentine rulers but as symbols of Italian greatness. Their legacy was woven into the narrative that Italy was destined to rise again, uniting under one flag after centuries of foreign domination. Darker tales. The Medici in scandal and legend, but while nationalists celebrated their glory, storytellers continued to whisper about their dark secrets. By the late 19th century, historians and amateur writers alike delved into tales of Medici poisonings, conspiracies, and betrayals. The legend of Catherine de' Medici in France, accused of dark arts and ruthless cruelty, fascinated audiences. The tragedy of Isabella de' Medici, strangled by her husband under suspicion of adultery, was retold as a Gothic tale of love and murder. The Medici became symbols not only of Renaissance brilliance, but of the dangers of unchecked power. They were remembered as much for their scandals as for their achievements, ensuring that fascination with their name never faded. The Medici, as modern symbols, by the turn of the 20th century, the Medici had transcended history to become almost mythological. They represented the archetypal Renaissance dynasty, embodying both light and shadow. To scholars, they were subjects of serious study, a family whose archives revealed the workings of Renaissance banking, politics, and patronage. To artists and writers, they were characters to be reimagined, their lives transformed into novels, operas, and paintings. To tourists, they were icons of Florence, guiding footsteps through the city's streets. The Medici had, in effect, become timeless. They were no longer just a dynasty that ruled from the 15th to the 18th century. They were cultural touchstones, part of the imagination of Europe and the wider world. Florence as their eternal stage. Through all these reinterpretations, Florence remained at the heart of the Medici story. The city itself was the greatest monument to their memory, the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, funded by their wealth, the frescoes of San Lorenzo, decorated under their patronage, the statues that filled piazzas, the paintings that filled palaces, the chapels where their bodies lay. For centuries after their fall, every corner of Florence whispered the Medici name. And as visitors gazed upon these treasures, the line between history and myth blurred. Were they seeing the past as it truly was, or the Medici as legend had reshaped them? From rulers to legends. By the end of the 19th century, the Medici had taken on a role that perhaps no other dynasty achieved so fully. They had become immortal symbols. Unlike the Valois of France or the Tudors of England, whose stories remained bound to political history, the Medici lived on in every brushstroke, every sculpture, every architectural wonder they had fostered. They were remembered not simply for ruling, but for shaping the cultural identity of the modern West. Their faults and their brilliance were inseparable, each amplifying the other. The Medici were gone. But the Medici story, retold, reshaped, and reimagined, had only grown stronger. The Medici in the modern age, film, scholarship, and cultural memory, the early 20th century, a scholarly obsession as The 20th century dawned. Historians increasingly turned their attention to the Renaissance as the cradle of modern civilization. At the center of that narrative stood the Medici. Italian scholars in Florence began cataloging the immense Medici archives, tens of thousands of letters, banking records, and state documents preserved over centuries. These records gave unprecedented insight into the family's inner workings, how Cosimo de' Medici manipulated politics through loans, how Lorenzo balanced diplomacy and patronage, how the banking empire both rose and fell. The Medici became more than legends. They became case studies in the birth of capitalism, modern statecraft, and cultural power. Economic historians examined the Medici Bank as a model of early finance. Political scientists analyzed their patronage as a form of soft power. In this sense, the Medici were rediscovered not only as colorful figures of the past, but as founders of systems that still shape the modern world. The Medici in popular imagination. While academics examined their archives, novelists and filmmakers began weaving their tales into popular culture. In the early 20th century, operas and stage plays often dramatized Medici scandals, the poisoning rumors, the affairs, the murders. Catherine de' Medici in France was especially popular, often depicted as a Black Widow queen scheming with astrologers and poisons. By the mid-century, historical fiction embraced the Medici as characters who could embody both grandeur and intrigue. Writers painted Lorenzo the Magnificent as a man torn between art and politics, Cosimo as the archetype of the cunning banker prince, and Isabella de' Medici as a tragic heroine. The Medici became part of the romanticized Renaissance that captured audiences worldwide. A world of marble palaces, candlelit plots, poisoned chalices, and genius artists. Conspiracies and dark myths, but alongside scholarly respect and fictional romanticism came darker interpretations. Throughout the 20th century, conspiracy theorists and sensationalist writers often painted the Medici as part of a secret web of influence. Some linked them to the rise of the Illuminati, claiming that their banking empire and occult interests tied them to secret societies that continued to manipulate world events. Others focused on rumors of poisonings and alchemical practices, presenting the Medici as shadowy figures dabbling in forbidden arts. Catherine de' Medici's association with Nostradamus, for instance, fueled stories of prophecy and sorcery. While serious historians dismissed these tales, they found fertile ground in popular imagination. The Medici, it seemed, could never quite escape their aura of mystery and danger. The Medici in cinema and television. By the second half of the 20th century, film and television brought the Medici story to millions who might never open a history book. Italian cinema occasionally explored Medici themes, but it was often international productions that popularized them. Television documentaries presented them as the godfathers of the Renaissance, comparing their family drama to modern crime dynasties. In more recent decades, the Medici have become stars of scripted drama. The television series Medici, Masters of Florence, 2016-2019, starring Dustin Hoffman and Richard Madden, brought their story to a global streaming audience. While historians noted its many inaccuracies, the show revived public fascination, especially with the early rise of Cosimo de' Medici. These dramatizations reinforced the Medici as household names, not distant rulers locked in textbooks, but living, breathing characters in stories of ambition, betrayal, and legacy. The tourist boom of Florence parallel. To this media exposure, Florence experienced a boom in global tourism during the 20th century. Millions flocked to the Uffizi Gallery, the Pitti Palace, and the Medici chapels, drawn by the city's Renaissance aura. Travel companies and guidebooks leaned heavily on the Medici name, branding them as the family who built Florence. Tour guides often emphasize not only the beauty of Medici patronage, but also their scandals, tales of murder, poison, and betrayal told against the backdrop of glittering palaces. Thus, Florence itself became a stage for retelling the Medici story. The family had ceased to exist, yet their city remained their greatest monument, now consumed by travelers seeking to walk in their footsteps. The Medici and the modern world. By the late 20th century, scholars and commentators began drawing parallels. Between the Medici and modern political and economic dynasties, Cosimo and Lorenzo were compared to tycoons who shaped politics through wealth. Medici patronage was likened to the way corporations sponsored universities, museums, or scientific research. Even the scandals of the family were viewed as timeless, proof that power, whether in the 15th century or the 20th, always carried corruption. Some writers argued that the Medici pioneered the very model of family-based capitalism that would later define global economies. Others saw them as forerunners of modern propaganda, using art and architecture as tools of political image-making. In this way, the Medici continued to feel strangely contemporary. Though centuries gone, their methods echoed in the boardrooms. Parliaments and cultural institutions of the modern age, legends that refused to die. Perhaps the most remarkable fact of the Medici story in the 20th century was its sheer endurance. Other dynasties faded into obscurity. The Gonzagas of Mantua, the Estes of Ferrara, the Sforzas of Milan, all had their moments, but their names became footnotes. The Medici, by contrast, lived on. Their name was invoked in classrooms, novels, films, and even casual conversations. About power and wealth, they became a shorthand for Renaissance, intrigue, and brilliance, and perhaps that was the greatest proof of their success. While their dynasty ended in 1737, their story had become immortal. Setting the stage for a global Renaissance. By the close of the 20th century, the Medici were no longer just Florentine history. They were global icons. Florence, with its Medici palaces and galleries, had become a pilgrimage site for millions. Scholars worldwide debated the meaning of their legacy. Filmmakers and writers retold their story again and again, and as the modern world wrestled with questions of wealth, influence, and legacy, the Medici remained strangely relevant, as if they had left behind not only art and architecture, but a playbook for power itself. The dynasty was gone, but the drama was eternal. The Medici in the 21st century, science, secrets, and streaming digging up the past. Medici tombs and DNA, the new millennium, brought with it tools the Renaissance could never have imagined. DNA sequencing, forensic anthropology, and advanced medical imaging. With these, scientists began unlocking secrets buried with the Medici for centuries. In Florence's Medici chapels, researchers carefully opened the ornate marble tombs, examining the remains of dukes, duchesses, and cardinals. Their goal, to answer long-debated mysteries. Were the many rumors of poisonings true? Did genetic diseases contribute to the dynasty's decline? What could the bones reveal about their health, their diets, their causes of death? Studies revealed that several members of the family suffered from rickets, likely caused by a lack of vitamin D despite their wealth. Proof that even princes could fall victim to environmental conditions. Other findings suggested that tuberculosis and gout plagued the Medici lineage, weakening later generations. Most tantalizing were the investigations into alleged poisonings. The sudden deaths of Francesco I and Bianca Capello had long been suspected to result from arsenic. Forensic tests initially seemed to confirm traces of arsenic in their remains, sparking headlines worldwide. Later studies, however, suggested more natural causes like malaria. The truth remains elusive, but the science breathed new life into centuries-old debates. proving that the Medici still held mysteries waiting to be uncovered. Catherine d' Medici and the Black Legend. In the 21st century, one Medici figure rose to particular prominence: Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France. Modern historians have sought to challenge the Black Legend that painted her as a poisoner and a ruthless manipulator. Recent scholarship emphasizes her role as a pragmatic ruler, navigating one of Europe's most turbulent eras, the French Wars of Religion. Yet popular culture continues to cast her as a dark, almost sorceress-like figure. Television series such as Reign and countless historical novels have dramatized her with intrigue, astrology, and shadowy plots. This dual image, Catherine as both capable queen and sinister matriarch, reflects the broader fascination with the Medici. They are never merely one thing. They remain layered, contradictory, and enigmatic. The Medici on screen, documentaries and dramas. The 21st century also brought a wave of documentaries and dramas exploring the Medici legacy. Documentaries from networks like PBS, BBC, and National Geographic presented the Medici as the godfathers of the Renaissance, blending scholarly insight with cinematic storytelling. The TV series Medici, Masters of Florence, 2016 to 2019, reached millions worldwide. Starring Richard Madden as Cosimo and Dustin Hoffman as Giovanni, it dramatized the rise of the family from bankers to power brokers. While historians noted its liberties with fact, audiences were captivated by the intrigue, the lavish sets, and the moral dilemmas of power. Streaming platforms made the Medici story available to global audiences like never before. For many viewers, their first introduction to the Renaissance came not from books, but from binge-watching the Medici saga on their screens. The dynasty had become a kind of intellectual entertainment franchise, their story retold in forms accessible to both scholars and casual viewers. Global fascination. Why the Medici still matter? Why do the Medici continue to fascinate in the 21st century? Perhaps because their story feels timeless. They were a banking dynasty who turned money into influence, a pattern that resonates in today's world of billionaires and political donors. They were patrons of genius, showing how culture and innovation flourish when given support. They were also embroiled in scandal, proving that power always carries danger, corruption, and human cost. In them, we see echoes of our own age. Families like the Rockefellers or Rothschilds, tech dynasties that shape global economies, or political houses that wield influence for generations. The Medici were not just a Renaissance phenomenon, they were the beginning of a recurring pattern in human history. Florence today, the Medici city. In today's Florence, the Medici presence is inescapable. Their palaces stand as museums. Their chapels attract endless lines of tourists. Their commissioned art fills the Uffizi and the Pitti Palace, now treasures of the world. Guides tell stories of Cosimo's political genius, Lorenzo's artistic brilliance, and Catherine's dark intrigues. Cafes, tours, and even wine labels carry the Medici name, selling history as an experience. For Florentines, the Medici are not just history, they are heritage and economy, ensuring that the dynasty continues to generate wealth centuries after its extinction. Modern myths and popular media, the Medici also thrive in the digital world. Online forums, YouTube documentaries, podcasts, and even TikTok accounts dedicate themselves to retelling their stories. Some emphasize the dark secrets, the poisonings, murders, and betrayals. Others highlight their role as cultural architects. The Medici have become content for a global audience that craves history not just in classrooms, but on screens, in podcasts, and in viral posts. Conspiracy theories also persist in online spaces, often linking the Medici to shadowy bloodlines of power that supposedly influence the modern world. These are more fantasy than fact, but they reflect how the Medici aura of mystery never fully fades. The enduring paradox in the 21st century. The Medici stand as a paradox. They are celebrated as patrons of the Renaissance, accused as conspirators of dark deeds, studied as founders of finance, and remembered as characters of legend. Their name resonates across disciplines: history, politics, economics, art, literature, film, and popular culture. Few families, past or present, can claim such a wide and lasting impact. Perhaps that is why their story endures. The Medici were never just rulers of Florence. They were builders of memory itself, and even today, more than 4 centuries since their dynasty ended, we are still telling their story, still seeking, in their rise and fall, the eternal lessons of power, art, and ambition. A dynasty that outlived itself. The Medici dynasty formally ended in 1737 with the death of Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, the last of the line. She was childless, frail, and weary of watching her once glorious family collapse into weakness and a scandal. Yet in her final act, she secured the Medici legacy. Through the family pact, Anna Maria Luisa willed the Medici treasures, their palaces, their libraries, their art collections, to the people of Florence, on the condition that they never be removed from the city. This single decision preserved the Uffizi Gallery, the Pitti Palace, and countless masterpieces that might otherwise have been scattered across Europe. It was, in many ways, the Medici's last act of power to ensure that Florence itself remained their monument. They had begun as bankers, but they ended as immortals, what they left behind. When we examine the Medici legacy, it stretches across multiple dimensions. Politics. They demonstrated how wealth could be transformed into political power, reshaping the concept of rulership. Cosimo de' Medici ruled not as a king, but as the hidden hand behind republican institutions, a model echoed in oligarchies and plutocracies to this day. Finance. They pioneered international banking, letters of credit, and financial networks that set the stage for global capitalism. Their rise and fall became lessons in risk, expansion, and overreach. Art and culture. Their patronage unleashed the Renaissance. Without the Medici, there may have been no Michelangelo's David, no Botticelli's Birth of Venus, no Brunelleschi's dome towering over Florence. They understood that art was not mere decoration, but a tool of immortality, science and thought. By funding Galileo and other scholars, they contributed to the scientific revolution, often unknowingly planting the seeds of modernity. Religion. By placing multiple popes on the throne of St. Peter, they influenced the course of Catholicism itself, for better and worse. This multifaceted legacy makes the Medici unique. They were not merely rulers. They were architects of systems that shaped the modern world, the dark secrets that haunt their memory. Yet admiration for the Medici always comes with unease. Their story is not only about patronage and brilliance, it is also riddled with dark secrets, the whispered poisonings of rivals, the suspicious deaths within the family itself, the manipulation of republics, courts, and even the papacy for personal gain, the ruthless silencing of enemies, whether by exile, execution, or intrigue. The Medici proved that the Renaissance was not only about rebirth and beauty, it was also about power, struggle, and shadows. The same hands that funded genius also orchestrated schemes. Perhaps that duality explains their enduring fascination. They were never purely noble nor purely corrupt. They were human, ambitious, flawed, and relentless. The Medici as a mirror of power. In reflecting on the Medici, we begin to see them less as distant Florentine rulers and more as a mirror of humanity's eternal struggle with power. Every age has its Medicis. Families or individuals who use wealth to influence politics, art, science, and public opinion. Some do so visibly, others in the shadows. The Medici remind us that behind every golden age there are patrons, financiers and power brokers making decisions that ripple for centuries. They also warn us, power rarely comes without cost. For every Botticelli painting, there was a political betrayal. For every dome or chapel built, there was a conspiracy whispered in candlelit corridors. The lessons of their story. The Medici leave us with lessons that remain as relevant now as they were in 15th century Florence. Money and power are intertwined. They demonstrated that financial capital could become political authority, a truth we still witness in modern democracies and global markets. Art as propaganda. Their commissions remind us that culture can be both genuine expression and deliberate messaging. A fresco could honor God, but it could also reinforce Medici prestige. The fragility of dynasties. For all their power, the Medici eventually withered, undone by disease, infertility, and excess. No empire is eternal, no matter how strong its foundations. The paradox of legacy. They are celebrated for fostering art and science, yet infamous for ruthlessness. It is this paradox that makes them unforgettable, proof that greatness and darkness often walk hand in hand. The emotional weight of their memory, walking through Florence today, one feels their presence everywhere. The Uffizi still whispers of their choices. The dome of Florence Cathedral, funded by Cosimo's wealth, looms like a monument to their vision. The Medici chapels, with their marble sarcophagi, remind us that even the mightiest rest in silence. But beyond monuments, the Medici story lingers in how we think about ambition itself. We admire them for their courage to dream. Even as we shudder at their methods, we celebrate their art while acknowledging the pain woven into its creation. The Medici, in the end, are not simply history. They are a meditation on the human condition. Toward the final chapter, as we near the conclusion of this documentary journey, the Medici stand revealed as both heroes and villains of the Renaissance. They nurtured genius, but they also nurtured fear. They gave Florence its golden age, but they also chained it to their name. Their dynasty ended long ago, yet their story refuses to fade. And perhaps that is the greatest testament of all, to be remembered not as saints nor as monsters, but as a family whose power shaped the world and whose secrets still haunt the imagination. Epilogue. The eternal shadow of the Medici, a quiet return to Florence. Close your eyes for a moment and picture Florence at dusk. The Arno glimmers as the sun fades, washing the city in shades of gold and violet. The cobblestones echo with footsteps, and the scent of baked bread drifts from quiet cafes. Above all towers the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, Brunelleschi's miracle, still defying time. This city is their monument. Every street, every chapel, every gallery whispers their name. Even in silence, Florence belongs to the Medici. The illusion of power, the permanence of memory, the Medici fought for centuries to preserve their rule. They poisoned, schemed, and maneuvered with ruthless determination. Yet dynasties crumble, bloodlines vanish, and power dissolves into dust. What endured was not their armies or their thrones, but their art, their ideas, and their memory. Michelangelo's David still stands. Botticelli's Venus still rises. Galileo's name still shines. These are the true monuments of Medici ambition, living legacies that transcend death. It is an irony they themselves may not have foreseen. In their hunger for power, they built something far greater than power could ever hold. The dark secret of the Medici. If there is a final dark secret, perhaps it is this. The Medici remind us that beauty often has a shadow, that behind the glow of genius lies struggle, sacrifice, and the murky hand of ambition. The Renaissance we celebrate as a dawn of human creativity was also a theater of control, propaganda, and fear. The Medici both liberated and dominated, enlightened and corrupted. Their story is a reminder that history itself is never pure. It is always stained with the fingerprints of those who held the strings. Why we cannot let them go. And yet, we are drawn back to them, again and again. The Medici are not just historical figures, they are archetypes. We recognize in them the timeless questions: how far would we go to protect power? Can greatness ever be achieved without compromise? Is legacy built on truth or the stories we choose to tell? They are our reflection, distorted yet familiar. In the Medici, we glimpse ourselves. A final walk among the chapels. Imagine now stepping into the Medici chapels deep within San Lorenzo. Marble walls rise high, filled with the quiet presence of statues Michelangelo carved. Night and day, dawn and dusk, guardians of eternity. There lie the bones of Cosimo, Lorenzo, Catherine, and countless others who once shaped the world. They rest in silence as all mortals do, their whispers carried only by stone. But as you stand there surrounded by art that still breathes centuries later, you realize something profound. The Medici are not gone. They live in every canvas, every dome, every idea they once dared to fund. Their bodies lie in Florence, but their shadows stretch across the centuries, the eternal whisper. And so we end as we began, with stillness. Picture once more the soft breeze through the cypress trees, the gentle rustle of leaves, the glow of candles in a darkened chapel. The Medici rise and fall has been told, their secrets laid bare, their triumphs remembered, their sins confessed. And yet, the story never truly ends. For every time we gaze at Renaissance art, for every time Florence stirs our imagination, for every time we wonder at the cost of power, the Medici whisper again: a dynasty may die, but memory is eternal, and in that eternity the Medici will always remain.